The heavy equipment engines roared as I stood at the edge of my family's century-old property line. 3 bulldozers idled just feet away from me, their operators avoiding my gaze. Behind them stood Karen Whitmore, arms crossed, a victorious smile stretching across her face as she waved a document in the air. "You have exactly 1 hour to remove your personal belongings before we demolish this eyesore," she announced, her voice carrying across what had been my family's land for 5 generations. My hands trembled not from fear, but from a rage so pure it nearly blinded me. The sheriff looked uncomfortable but maintained his position beside her. That is when I realized they had forgotten one crucial detail about this town. My ancestors built it, named it, and the documents Karen was so proudly waving were worth less than the dirt beneath my boots. The first sign that something was wrong came when I returned from my 3-day business trip to Austin. I had been presenting our family farm's organic produce line to a major distributor, something my father would have been proud of. The long drive back to Willow Creek had left me exhausted, but as I approached the familiar dirt road leading to my property, something red caught my eye. A bright crimson notice had been nailed, not taped, not hung, but nailed, directly into the cedar post of my hand-carved gate. The same gate my grandfather had built with his own calloused hands 60 years ago. I stepped out of my truck, the engine still running, and yanked the paper from the wood. In bold black lettering across the top were the words eviction notice, followed by smaller text stating, violation of HOA ordinances, and a demand to vacate the premises within 14 days. I read it 3 times, convinced my road-weary mind was playing tricks on me. The notice was signed by something called the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and cited violations of community standards, unauthorized structures, and improper land usage. None of it made sense. My 5 acres had been in my family since before Willow Creek was even incorporated as a town. I drove through my gate and parked beside my modest farmhouse. The property looked exactly as I had left it. The weathered red barn stood proudly against the afternoon sun. My small vegetable garden was perhaps a bit overgrown after my absence, but otherwise nothing had changed. No new construction, no alterations, nothing that could possibly justify an eviction notice. After unpacking my suitcase, I walked the entire perimeter of my land. The old split-rail fence marking the boundary between my property and the newer Oak Ridge Estates development stood intact. I had maintained that fence meticulously over the years, despite the development encroaching closer and closer to my land with each passing season. The following morning, I called the number printed at the bottom of the notice. A woman with a clipped, professional tone answered, "Oak Ridge Estates HOA, how may I help you?" "This is Alexander Willow. I found an eviction notice on my property, and I need to speak with someone about this immediately," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Oh, Mr. Willow," she replied, her tone cooling noticeably. "I have been instructed not to discuss your case. It is currently under pending legal review." "Legal review? What case? I have never joined your HOA. My property predates your entire neighborhood by over 100 years, I explained, my patience waning. "I am sorry, sir, but I cannot provide any further information. You will need to vacate as indicated in the notice or face further legal consequences. Good day." The line went dead. I slammed the phone down and stared out my kitchen window. Across the field, I could see the cookie-cutter houses of Oak Ridge Estates with their perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. I decided to approach my closest neighbor, Jim Parson, who had always been friendly since moving in 2 years ago. As I walked toward his property, I noticed him working in his yard. The moment he spotted me, his eyes widened and he quickly turned away, busying himself with trimming hedges that were already immaculately maintained. "Jim," I called out. "Got a minute?" "Sorry, Alex," he mumbled without making eye contact. "Really busy today." He disappeared into his garage, the door automatically closing behind him. That evening, as darkness fell over Willow Creek, I heard a vehicle slow down near my mailbox. By the time I reached my front porch, the car had sped away, but my mailbox had been vandalized with eggs, their yellow contents dripping down the metal surface onto the ground below. I stood there in the dim porch light, anger and confusion battling within me. The land beneath my feet had been tilled by 5 generations of willows. My great-great-grandfather had founded this town in 1889. The courthouse downtown bore our family name on its cornerstone. This property was not subject to any homeowners association, and yet someone was trying to force me out. As I cleaned the egg from my mailbox, I made a silent promise to myself. Whoever was behind this would soon learn that the Willow family roots ran deeper than any HOA covenant could ever reach. The following morning, I drove to the public library to use their computer and research this so-called jurisdiction claim. Willow Creek was a small town, but our library had digitized most local records, thanks to a grant my aunt had secured years ago. Within an hour, I had accessed the Oak Ridge Estate's HOA documentation and discovered what I had suspected. A recent amendment to their boundaries had mysteriously incorporated my land. The meeting minutes showed the motion had been proposed by the new HOA president, Karen Whitmore. The name was vaguely familiar, though I could not immediately place it. According to the records, she had moved to Willow Creek just 18 months ago and had quickly risen to power within the community organization. I printed the relevant documents and headed to the county records office. The clerk, Martha Jenkins, had known my family for decades. "Alexander Willow," she said warmly as I entered, "what brings you to the dusty world of property records?" I explained the situation, and her smile faded. "That Whitmore woman has been in here multiple times, digging through boundary maps and asking strange questions about your property," Martha revealed, her voice lowered. "I told her your land was privately held and exempt from their community overlay, but she seemed determined to find a loophole." Martha helped me locate the original land grant documents. The yellowed papers, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, bore the state seal and the signature of the governor from 1889, conveying the land to Thomas Willow, my great-great-grandfather, as recognition for his service to the state. Additional documents showed the land had been properly transferred through generations, with all taxes paid and boundaries maintained. Armed with these records, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, scheduled for that very evening. The community center was packed when I arrived. I recognized several faces, people who had previously waved to me at the local farmers market where I sold my produce each weekend. Now they averted their eyes as I took a seat in the back row. Karen Whitmore stood at the podium, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. Her tailored blazer and pencil skirt projected an image of authority as she addressed the room with practiced confidence. "As promised, we have begun enforcement of our expanded district guidelines," she announced proudly. "Properties not in compliance have been notified." She continued with updates on landscaping restrictions and parking violations before opening the floor for questions. I raised my hand, and Karen's smile tightened when she saw me. "The gentleman in the back," she acknowledged reluctantly. I stood, documents in hand. "My name is Alexander Willow," I began, noticing a few whispers ripple through the crowd. "I received an eviction notice claiming my property falls under HOA jurisdiction. I would like to understand when exactly my land, which has been in my family for over a century, became subject to your authority." Karen's eyes narrowed. Mr. Willow, we voted last month to extend our community overlay boundaries to include previously unincorporated properties adjacent to our development. Your land, being an eyesore and potential safety hazard, was specifically included in this measure. An eyesore, I questioned, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger. My working farm has been there since before Oak Ridge Estates was even conceived. Perhaps in its day it was charming, Karen said with a dismissive wave. But times change, Mr. Willow. Your outdated structures, livestock, and general appearance detract from neighborhood property values. The board voted unanimously. I stepped forward, placing my documents on the table. These are the original land grants signed by the state governor. My property is privately held and legally exempt from any HOA jurisdiction. Your vote, regardless of its validity, cannot supersede state law. Karen barely glanced at the papers. Our lawyers disagree, she said coolly. Perhaps if you had attended the meetings instead of playing farmer, you would understand the legal framework involved. The condescension in her voice sparked something within me. I straightened my posture and looked around the room. For those who might not be familiar with local history, my name is Alexander Willow. Yes, the same Willow as on the town's welcome sign, the same Willow as on the courthouse cornerstone, the same Willow as the town itself. Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Karen's face paled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Your family history is irrelevant to modern zoning regulations, Mr. Willow. On the contrary, I replied. My family donated the land this town was built on. The deed restrictions explicitly prohibit the kind of overreach you are attempting. I am not asking to be exempt from your HOA rules, Mrs. Whitmore. I am informing you that your HOA has no legal standing to issue notices on my property whatsoever. For a moment the room was completely silent. Then Karen slammed her gavel down. This meeting is not the appropriate forum for property disputes. Please direct further inquiries to our legal counsel. She quickly moved to the next agenda item, but the damage was done. People were looking at me differently now, with recognition, respect, and in some cases, guilt. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached me with apologetic expressions. One elderly woman squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your grandfather would be proud. Stand your ground." The next morning, I called my cousin Michael, who worked as a clerk at the city planning office. I need to see everything related to the Oak Ridge Estates expansion proposal, I told him. Permit applications, boundary adjustments, voting records, everything. Michael hesitated. Alex, there is something odd about that whole situation. The paperwork came through in a rush, and most of it was pushed through during the holiday week when half the staff was out. That afternoon, I pored over the files Michael had gathered. The inconsistencies were glaring. The vote to expand HOA jurisdiction had been held during a special session not advertised in the standard channels. The meeting minutes were suspiciously brief, and only 4 board members had been present, just enough for a quorum. Most damning of all, I discovered that 2 of those board members, Jason Meeks and Diane Foster, had received landscaping contracts for their properties from Sterling Landscapes just days after the vote. Sterling Landscapes was owned by none other than Karen Whitmore's husband. I expanded my investigation to the county level, visiting the recorder's office and the tax assessor. My property had never been rezoned from agricultural to residential use. The HOA expansion documents filed with the county made no specific mention of my land, instead using vague terminology about adjacent undeveloped parcels, despite my property being actively farmed. I began collecting affidavits from neighbors who had been misled about the expansion. Elderly, Mrs. Peterson confided that she had been told the vote was merely about standardizing mailboxes on the perimeter roads. The Johnsons admitted they had signed paperwork without reading it after Karen assured them it was just routine boundary clarification. I contacted my Aunt Eleonora, a retired circuit court judge who had served Willow County for 3 decades. She invited me to her home, a stately Victorian on Maple Street, where I spread the documents across her polished dining table. Aunt Eleonora studied the papers carefully, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "They have no legal standing whatsoever," she finally declared. "Their procedural violations alone would invalidate the expansion, but more importantly, they cannot simply vote to claim jurisdiction over established private property with protected agricultural status." She helped me organize my evidence and suggested a comprehensive legal strategy. "Do not just defend your position, Alexander," she advised. "Go on the offensive. File a formal complaint with the county about their procedural violations. Request an injunction against any further action toward your property. And most importantly, document everything." I followed her advice methodically. Each day, I gathered more evidence of the HOA's improper actions. I photographed my property boundaries, collected historical records, and built a timeline of events leading to the eviction notice. A certified letter arrived at my door 1 week into my investigation. It was a cease and desist order from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, claiming I was engaged in harassment and defamation of board members by questioning their authority. The letter was signed by Karen Whitmore and included a threat of further legal action if I continued my disruptive activities. Far from intimidating me, the letter only confirmed I was on the right track. Karen was getting nervous. I redoubled my efforts, expanding my search to include Karen's history before she arrived in Willow Creek. What I discovered was illuminating. She had served on 2 previous HOA boards in different communities, both ending in controversy and resident complaints. I prepared to take my findings to the county commissioner's office. This was no longer just about protecting my land. It was about exposing a pattern of abuse that threatened the entire community. I decided transparency would be my most powerful weapon. I drafted a detailed public notice titled HOA Jurisdictional Overreach, the facts, and included documented evidence of the procedural violations, conflict of interest, and historical context of my property's exemption from their authority. I posted these notices on community bulletin boards throughout town, the grocery store, the post office, the coffee shop, and the library. The response was immediate. People began talking, questioning, and most importantly, researching on their own. The local newspaper, the Willow Creek Chronicle, picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA attempts to evict descendant of town founder, legal questions mount." The reporter, Jessica Simmons, interviewed me on my front porch. "Mr. Willow, what do you believe is the real motivation behind this attempt to claim jurisdiction over your property?" she asked. "I cannot speak to motivations," I replied carefully. "I can only point to facts. My land is the last large private property adjacent to Oak Ridge Estates. It represents 5 acres of prime real estate that, if developed, could be worth millions. But this land has value beyond dollars and cents. It represents our town's history and my family's legacy." The article included photographs of my property, alongside historical images of the Willow family farm from the early 1900s. The visual continuity was striking. The same red barn, though weathered, still standing proudly after more than a century. Following the article's publication, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped by to express support. Jim Parson came over with a freshly baked apple pie from his wife. "We never wanted any of this," he confessed. "Karen told us your property was being sold to developers anyway, and the HOA was just ensuring proper integration into the neighborhood." Other residents shared similar stories of misinformation. The tide was turning, but Karen doubled down. She sent a mass email to all Oak Ridge Estates residents claiming I was manipulating public sentiment with nostalgic propaganda and warning that property values would plummet if unregulated agricultural use was permitted to continue adjacent to their homes. In response, I decided to host an open house on my property the following Saturday. I sent invitations throughout the community, including to the HOA board members. "Come see the reality of the Willow family farm," the invitation read. "Learn about our town's history and the truth behind recent claims." The turnout exceeded my expectations. Over 60 people arrived, many bringing their children. I gave tour of the historic barn, showed them the original well that had supplied water to the first settlers, and explained how my great-great-grandfather had donated land for the town's first school and church. As I was describing the sustainable farming practices I had implemented, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Karen Whitmore emerged, smartphone in hand, recording video as she approached the gathering. "I hope everyone realizes they are trespassing on property subject to pending legal action," she announced loudly. The crowd fell silent, looking between Karen and me. I smiled and stepped forward, extending my hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, welcome to Willow Farm. Would you care for some homemade lemonade? The lemons come from our greenhouse." Karen ignored my hand, continuing to film. "Mr. Willow, this publicity stunt does not change the legal realities. Your property is in violation of multiple community standards, and the board has voted." "Perhaps we should discuss those specific violations," I interrupted calmly. "I would be happy to address any legitimate concerns about my property." "Your entire operation is the violation," she snapped. "This is a residential area now, not some historical preservation zone." An elderly man stepped forward, Mr. Jenkins, who had been the town's history teacher for 40 years before retiring. "Young lady, this land has been zoned agricultural since before zoning existed in this county. The Willow Farm is literally on the historical registry." Karen's expression faltered momentarily. "Historical registry or not, the HOA has jurisdiction now," she insisted, though with less conviction. "Actually," my Aunt Eleonora interjected, her judge's voice commanding attention, "I have brought copies of the county zoning maps and the historical registry documentation. Anyone interested is welcome to review them." She gestured to a table where she had arranged the documents. Several people, including 2 HOA board members who had quietly joined the gathering, moved toward the table. Karen looked flustered. "This is all irrelevant. The board has voted." "The board voted based on incorrect information," one of the board members said quietly. "I think we need to revisit this entire matter." Karen stormed back to her SUV and drove away, gravel spitting from beneath her tires. The mood lightened immediately, and the afternoon continued with stories, history lessons, and community connection. My land had become more than private property. It had become a symbol of resistance against overreach and a reminder of the town's authentic roots. By the end of the day, a petition was circulating calling for a special meeting to dissolve the current HOA leadership and elect a new board. But I knew Karen would not surrender her power without a fight. 3 days after the open house, my phone rang early in the morning. It was Tom Bradley, the HOA treasurer, his voice hushed and nervous. "Alex, we need to meet. Not at my house or yours, somewhere private." We arranged to meet at the fishing dock by Willow Creek Lake, a quiet spot rarely visited on weekday mornings. Tom arrived looking sleep-deprived and anxious. He handed me a USB drive. "I have been reviewing our financial records more carefully since your open house. There are irregularities you should see." That evening, I reviewed the files with Aunt Eleonora. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern of financial mismanagement under Karen's leadership. HOA dues had been diverted to an administrative discretionary fund that Karen controlled with minimal oversight. From there, money had been spent on questionable expenses. Premium landscaping for her own property classified as demonstration gardens. Expensive window treatments listed as community center improvements. And most damning of all, a 2-week trip to a Florida resort logged as a leadership training seminar that only Karen and her husband had attended. "This goes beyond jurisdictional overreach," Aunt Eleonora noted gravely. "This is potential embezzlement." The next morning, printed copies of the financial records appeared in every mailbox in Oak Ridge Estates. No one knew who had distributed them, though Tom looked particularly pale at the emergency HOA meeting called that evening. The community center was packed beyond capacity. Residents stood along the walls, their expressions ranging from concerned to outright angry. Karen attempted to maintain control, banging her gavel repeatedly as accusations flew from all sides. "Order, we will have order," she demanded, her composure cracking. "These financial documents were stolen and taken out of context." "Is it out of context that you spent $12,000 on custom window treatments for your home while claiming it was for the community center?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her elderly voice surprisingly strong. "Because I volunteer at the community center twice a week, and those windows still have the same faded blinds they have had for years." More questions followed, each more specific than the last. Karen's responses grew increasingly defensive and contradictory. The board members sat uncomfortably beside her, looking shell-shocked as the financial misdeeds were laid bare. Finally, Richard Oakes, a retired accountant, stood up. "I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board president and elect an interim leader while a full audit is conducted." The motion was seconded by multiple voices. Karen's face reddened. "You cannot do this. I have brought property values up by 15%. I have enforced standards that make this community desirable." "By stealing from us," someone shouted from the back. "By trying to seize private property through fraudulent means," called another voice. "By lying to the board about the legal status of adjacent lands." This came from Jason Meeks, one of the board members who had received the landscaping contract. Karen's composure finally shattered. "You ungrateful people have no idea what it takes to maintain standards. This community was falling apart before I took control. That decrepit farm is an eyesore that brings down everyone's property values. I was doing you all a favor." The room fell silent at her outburst. Then, methodically, Richard Oakes began collecting votes. The result was unanimous. Karen was removed as president effective immediately, and Tom Bradley was appointed interim leader until proper elections could be held. Karen stood frozen at the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped its edges. "You will regret this," she said, her voice eerily calm. "When your property values plummet because of that historical junkyard next door, you will beg me to come back." She grabbed her designer purse and stormed out. After the meeting, the newly reorganized board approached me. "Mr. Willow, We would like to formally retract the eviction notice issued to your property, Tom said, and we would like to invite you to join the board as a community advisor. Your family's history and your knowledge of local ordinances would be invaluable. I thanked them for the retraction but declined the position. I appreciate the offer, but my place is on my farm, not in community politics. However, I would be happy to help draft a new code of conduct that respects private property rights and ensures transparency in HOA operations. Tom nodded gratefully. That would be extremely helpful, and I speak for many when I say we are sorry for allowing this situation to develop. I shook his hand. Communities make mistakes. What matters is how they correct them. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity. The interim HOA board, under Tom's leadership, worked diligently to correct the damage done during Karen's tenure. They formally dissolved the jurisdictional expansion that had included my land, filing proper documentation with the county to ensure no future board could attempt similar overreach. I received an official letter of apology, signed by each board member, acknowledging that my property had never legally fallen under their jurisdiction. The letter was also printed in the Willow Creek Chronicle as a public statement. The newspaper ran a feature on the history of the Willow family farm, highlighting its significance to the town's founding and development. The article included an announcement that the annual Founders' Day celebration would include special recognition of my family's contributions to the community. With the threat to my property removed, I turned my attention to repairing the damage done during the conflict. The wooden gate post, marred by the nail holes from the eviction notice, needed replacement. I selected a cedar log from the wooded section of my property and spent several days carving and finishing a new post that matched my grandfather's original design. My father, now living in a nursing home on the other side of town, asked to visit when he heard about the gate replacement. At 86, his health was fragile, but his mind remained sharp. I brought him to the farm on a clear autumn morning. He sat in his wheelchair at the entrance, running his weathered hand over the new post. "You did good work, son," he said, his voice thin but proud. "Your grandfather would approve." Tears glistened in his faded blue eyes. "This land remembers who tends it." I understood what he meant. The soil beneath our feet held the history of our family, their sweat, their labor, their commitment. No paper document could ever sever that connection. The Founders' Day celebration that year was particularly meaningful. The town square was decorated with historical photographs, including many of the original Willow homestead. I was asked to speak about my family's vision for the community when they first established it. My great-great-grandfather believed in the balance between progress and tradition, I told the gathered crowd. He welcomed new neighbors and new ideas, but he also understood that some things should be preserved, not as museum pieces, but as living connections to our shared history. After the celebration, I placed a simple stone marker near my front gate. Carved into the granite were the words, "This land was never yours to take." Not a threat or a rebuke, but a quiet reminder of truth that would stand long after the conflict had been forgotten. As autumn turned to winter, I completed the restoration of the damaged sections of my property. The barn received a fresh coat of traditional red paint. The split-rail fence was repaired and reinforced. The family cemetery at the far edge of the property, where 5 generations of willows rested, was cleared of overgrowth and restored to proper condition. Each repair felt like healing, not just for the property but for the community itself. The land had spoken, and finally it had been heard. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a sense of renewal. My mornings returned to their familiar rhythm, coffee on the porch at sunrise, tending to the vegetable garden, maintaining the buildings, and planning for the growing season ahead. No angry notes appeared on my gate. No neighbors averted their eyes when I passed. Peace had returned to Willow Creek. I began hosting historical tour on my land for local schools. Children would arrive on yellow buses, wide-eyed at the sight of the red barn and the ancient oak trees that had stood witness to over a century of history. I would show them the original well, the hand-forged tools in the barn, and the boundary stones that had marked the property since before their great-grandparents were born. "This is living history," I would tell them. "Not something trapped behind glass in a museum, but something that continues to grow and change while honoring what came before." The Oak Ridge Estates HOA did reform under new leadership. They established clearer boundaries, both literal and figurative, and adopted transparency measures that prevented the kind of overreach that had characterized Karen's administration. They left my land entirely alone, recognizing it as the separate entity it had always been. Occasionally, residents would stop by with questions about gardening or local history. Some apologized for their silence during the conflict. I accepted their words with grace, understanding that community healing required forgiveness. Jim Parson became a regular visitor, helping me repair fencing and learning traditional farming techniques. "My grandfather had a place like this back in Minnesota," he confided one day. "I always regretted not learning his methods before he passed. It feels right to connect with that history again." One morning in late spring, I noticed unusual activity at Karen's house. Moving trucks were parked in the driveway and workers carried furniture and boxes to the vehicles. Karen and her husband supervised the loading, their expressions tight and unwelcoming. By evening, a "sold" sign stood in their front yard. They left town without farewell parties or goodbyes. I heard later that Karen's husband had accepted a job in another state, whether by choice or necessity. No one knew for certain. The new owners of their home were a young couple with 2 small children who seemed delighted by the neighborhood and eager to become part of the community. Life continued its steady pace. The seasons changed, crops were planted and harvested, and the rhythms of the land remained unbroken. At times, the conflict with the HOA seemed like a distant dream, unpleasant but ultimately unable to alter the essential truth of this place. On the anniversary of the eviction notice, I sat on my porch as the sun set over fields my ancestors had tilled. I thought about them: Thomas Willow, who had claimed this land and helped establish the town; his son James, who had expanded the farm during difficult economic times; my grandfather, who had preserved it through war and depression; my father, who had taught me to be its steward. They would have been proud, not because I had won a battle, but because I had recognized what was worth fighting for. This land was more than property. It was memory made manifest, tradition given physical form, promise kept through generations. In the distance, lights began to appear in the windows of Oak Ridge Estates homes. Those houses and their residents were now part of Willow Creek's ongoing story. Not enemies or intruders, but new chapters in a tale that had begun long before any of us and would continue long after we were gone. Some roots grow so deep that no paper vote can touch them. Some truths stand so firm that no temporary power can bend them. The land remembers, even when people forget. And in that memory lies both our heritage and our hope.